We needed to find and kill Osama bin Laden as quickly as we possibly could. I needed 36 people. I needed millions of dollars in cash. I needed guns, ammunition, secure communications, night vision goggles, stun grenades. That Abu Zubaydah told FBI agent Ali Sufan during an interrogation that Mukhtar, he actually laughed when he said it. He said, "You don't know who Mukhtar is?"
Shannon Airport in the west of Ireland, there was rumors that it was used as a staging post for Rendition. Are you aware of anything?
I was arrested and charged with 3 counts of espionage. The president says, "Well, now what do we do?" And everybody turns and looks at me.
But life, in principle, never ceases to hold a meaning for each and every person.
John Kiriakou, thank you so much for joining me. I can't tell you how excited I am to get an opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
My pleasure. Okay, let's start from the beginning. There's 2 things I want to know. First of all, what characteristics and attributes did you have that made you interesting to the CIA? And how were you recruited?
I think there were several things in retrospect. I had an advanced degree and I was young. I finished graduate school when I was 24 years old. I spoke a relatively difficult foreign language, Greek at the time. And I mean, it sounds kind of silly to say it, but I had a passion for public service. I only considered jobs in public service. And so I thought, oh, one of these days I'll end up on Capitol Hill or in the Foreign Service. And then when I was in graduate school, my advisor, who happened to be a psychiatrist, a very well-known, really an eminent psychiatrist, Dr. Gerald Post, he's the one that recruited me into the CIA. He was a CIA officer undercover as a university professor, and he recruited me to work in the office that he had created at the CIA, the Office of Leadership Analysis. So that's how I got in. I got there at the age of 25. I was young and eager. I had a degree in Middle Eastern Studies and a master's degree in legislative affairs, but my focus was on foreign policy analysis. So I was a good fit for that.
What attributes were you particularly exceptionally intelligent? Were you mathematical? Were you analytical? Like when I think about a CIA operative, I think of somebody of exceptional intelligence. You would have to be.
I'm I guess more intelligent than the norm, I suppose. But I remember taking a battery of exams and then being shown my results. And among people in the CIA, I was slightly smarter than the average CIA officer. When I transferred to operations, I tested much smarter than the average operations officer. But among analysts, I was just to the right of the norm.
So you're in the CIA. It's the late 80s, 1990s. You have a meteoric rise.
Yeah, it was very quick. Yeah.
And you were posted. You were studying Saddam Hussein, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
Reporting in the administration, reporting to HW.
Yes. This was the nice thing about the Office of Leadership Analysis, which no longer exists, by the way, is that this was an organization, an office that was mandated by the White House. And that's why it was created, because the president, the vice president, and the national security advisor wanted psychological insights into the people that they were either dealing with or opposing, as in the case of Saddam Hussein, or let's say the Iranian religious leadership. And so most of what we wrote went directly to the principals, the president, the vice president, the national security advisor, the secretaries of state and defense, their deputies, and then just a small handful of people on the National Security Council. It was a very small audience that we were targeting.
So the Gulf War I breaks out, and you had to go to the White House at one stage, didn't you?
Right.
What happened?
You know, on June 30th, 1990, a colleague of mine wrote a paper saying that he believed Saddam Hussein was going to invade Kuwait. He got real pushback on this paper internally because everybody else believed that Saddam would cross the border into Kuwait and just take a very thin, very narrow strip of land along the border that included the southernmost tip of the Rumaila oil field. Now, the Rumaila oil field was 90-something% in Iraq, and just the southernmost bit of it crossed the border into Kuwait. Well, the Kuwaitis were slant drilling, and they were stealing the oil. They slant drilled underneath the border, and they were essentially stealing Iraqi oil. That was the Iraqis' reason for going in. So most everybody believed that Saddam would cross the border 2 kilometers, take that little strip, and that would be the end of it. And that's not what my colleague predicted. So what we ended up doing was just a couple of days before the invasion, we asked the U.S. Defense Attaché in Baghdad to drive south to the border, just drive, get in the car and drive, and then drive back to Baghdad and just type us a cable and tell us what he saw. And what he saw was literally the entire Iraqi military moving south to the border. Well, if you're going to take 2 kilometers of sandy wasteland, you're not going to send your entire military to the border. Well, that was clear that made it clear to us that he was going to invade all of Kuwait, which he did. So what you referred to a moment ago, that invasion took place on August the 2nd, 1990. Honestly, I'm not overstating it, but that was the day that changed my life because I was 25 years old. I got to the office early, and just as I arrived, my boss said, "Don't take off your jacket. We're going to the White House." I had never been to the White House other than as a tourist. And so we got in a car. The driver took us to the White House. We were escorted into the Oval Office. It was the president, the vice president, the national security advisor, the director of the CIA, my boss, and me. And that was it. So when the president sits down in his, wingback chair that is famous on television, the vice president sat in the other wingback. My boss and I sat on a couch, and the president says, "Well, now what do we do?" And everybody turns and looks at me. And it shook me for a moment. And then I got my bearings and I said, "Well, here's what we're up against." And everything that I had prepared in those previous, 4.5 weeks came out. It was exciting and it was scary, but it made a name for me. And I was lucky too, I was lucky in a couple of respects. I was lucky because that invasion took place right at the point where I felt like I knew what I was doing. And it was blind luck that when I was hired, I was put on the Iraq desk. And when I very gently complained at one point that, sometimes I would go a whole day and not a single cable would come in. I would just kind of sit there all day like, well, now what do I do? Because nothing ever happened in Iraq. It was the same cabinet, since the 1968 revolution. Our embassy had like 4 people in it. The newspapers didn't cover Iraq. NSA, the Pentagon, didn't really have any interest in Iraq. And
Had
so
al-Qaeda even been formed at this stage?
No, al-Qaeda came 5 years later. Al-Qaeda came in response to the American response to the invasion of Kuwait, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Al-Qaeda came about because the US sent so many troops and so many planes to Saudi Arabia that we essentially occupied all of Saudi Arabia's military bases. And Osama bin Laden said that he wanted to force the US military out of what he called the land of the 2 holy mosques, Mecca and Medina. And so he began by using propaganda, saying that female soldiers were driving in violation of Saudi law, that American soldiers were having sex in Mecca right in front of the holy Kaaba, that women were walking around the military bases topless or naked. None of this silliness was true. But it resonated with Saudi citizens, especially with the very religious ones. And Al-Qaeda was born around 1984. 1985, they carried out their first attack. That was called the OPM Sang bombing. OPM Sang was a joint military base between the US Army and the Saudi National Guard, Sang, Saudi Arabian National Guard. And to the best of my recollection, it killed 5 people. None of them were Americans. They were all third country nationals. I think most of them were Indians that happened to be working at the base. But this shook us because this is where, I mean, I did all of my grocery shopping at OPM Sang. There were hundreds of Americans there at any given time. There was a movie theater and a bowling alley and, you know, a mess hall, and you could just go spend the day. We would go do dry cleaning and grocery shopping and whatever. So for them to have been able to infiltrate it and set off a number of bombs that killed 5 and wounded dozens was shaking to us.
This was 1994, 1995 time period.
That was in 95. Yeah, I happened to be in Bahrain when it took place, and I couldn't believe that it was a domestic Saudi terrorist group. But that's how it started. The Saudis cracked down hard on it, and they arrested almost 24 men. They all made identical confessions on Saudi television, which, of course, told me that they were coerced, and they were almost immediately beheaded. But bin Laden got away, fled to Sudan, and then later on from Sudan to Afghanistan, and the rest is history.
And the history is, so before 9/11 in July, and we'll skip forward here, you were in the CIA, you came across information that indicated al-Qaeda were planning something big. Dick Clark, the former head of the defense secretary in the Clinton administration, also was trying to get through to the Bush administration, and he was indicating something similar. A couple of months later, we have 9/11 and the rest. Of course, it changed the entire history of the world.
The whole world.
If I was an American, and of course Americans were furious, and Clinton has spoken about this, and why were the CIA and why was the Bush administration not paying more attention to al-Qaeda?
Yeah, literally volumes of books have been written on this, and I'm not sure even with those books if we will ever come to a national consensus. I can tell you what I saw. I wish I could take credit for saying that, that an attack was going to happen. That came from George Tenet, who was the CIA director at the time, Cofer Black, who was the CIA's Counterterrorism Center director, and Dick Clark, as you mentioned. Dick had a number of different jobs, in senior level jobs in government. He spent the entirety of the Clinton administration as the senior director for counterterrorism at the National Security Council. He maintained that job very briefly under George W. Bush and then was just pushed out. They didn't like him. And it's because Dick was a truth teller. But they saw Dick as a troublemaker. The George W. Bush people were not interested in terrorism. In fact, Condoleezza Rice told George and Dick that they were overestimating the threat to the United States, that the real threat to the United States was China, and that we needed to focus on China, not on these Arabs who don't even have a country, right? Well, George and Dick were the ones who were right, and W and Condoleezza Rice were the ones who were wrong. Now, with that said, this was the biggest intelligence failure in American history. And when I say intelligence, I don't mean just a CIA failure. I mean CIA, FBI, NSA, State Department, Defense Department. Everybody failed. The Congressional Oversight Committees failed. Everybody failed. So there's plenty of blame to go around. But in my view, the biggest failure was the failure of the CIA and the FBI to cooperate with one another on these cases. For example, the CIA knew that the hijackers were in the United States. They didn't tell the FBI because they thought they could recruit some of these hijackers to inform on Osama bin Laden. They didn't know that an attack was imminent, but they knew that these dangerous guys were in the United States. They didn't
Did they know
the FBI.
They were in flight school, John?
No, they didn't know they were in flight school. And that's a major FBI failure. Because the FBI didn't tell the CIA, hey, we have information that these very specific people, these named people, are threats to the United States. We can't find them. Well, the CIA knew where they were not hiding, where they were living. You know, San Diego, Florida. Yeah. We didn't know they were in flight school. But that's what I mean when I say failure. There was this breakdown in communication. If the two organizations had worked together, they could have developed this information. Like, did it not occur to anybody at any level, even the clerk at the flight school, that these guys were very specific in that they told their instructors, we want to learn how to take off and fly, but we don't want to learn how to land. Well, I got my pilot's license. Landing is the hardest part, but it's the most important part. So if somebody were to come up to me and say, I want to learn how to fly, but I don't care about learning how to land, that would be very alerting to me. And if these guys happen to be foreign nationals, you know, with expired visas in some cases, my first call would be to the FBI. And nobody thought to do that.
I remember traveling around the United States. I was all over the place. I flew in and out, in and back from. There was no security.
No,
there was
nothing.
No Homeland Security. There was nothing. There was a lackadaisical. I mean, it has changed dramatically since that time period, of course. But I sometimes I wonder, are we doing hindsight bias here, looking back? But then again, when you think about in 1992, the Twin Towers, there was an attack on the Twin Towers as well. So it's not completely fantastical to wonder, you know.
Well, and I'll tell you another thing. Before 9/11, this was 1997, I was instructed to support an operation, a domestic operation. And I was instructed to work with the FBI. I think I can say it was in New York. So 2 FBI agents, when I arrived, I just took the train up to New York. 2 FBI agents picked me up and they said they wanted to give me a tour of New York. I said, oh, no, I've been to New York 1,000 million times. My brother lives here. I said, I don't need a tour. They said, no, we're going to give you a special tour. And I remember driving up First Avenue and they pointed at this unmarked storefront that you would pass 1,000 times and never pay any attention to it. Said, see that storefront? That's the headquarters for the Hezbollah cell in New York, and they're planning a giant attack. I said, well, what the hell are you guys doing? Why don't you bust down the door and grab them? He said, no, we're waiting for them to sort of hang themselves. Well, I never heard of any arrests ever made in New York of Hezbollah operatives. Now, if you can identify the actual location where these guys are meeting and presumably conspiring to carry out a terrorist attack, don't you think you might want to do something about it?
Well, you might bug the place even, like, I mean...
At least bug it. Exactly. Or recruit somebody to penetrate it.
Mm. So So 9/11 happens. Where were you on 9/11?
I was in CIA headquarters, and that was kind of an important day for me, even before the attacks, because Kofor Black and I, again, Kofor was the director of the Counterterrorism Center. Kofor and I had an appointment with Condi Rice at 9 o'clock to go over something that's very quaint at this point. So the government printing office, the GPO, it's up on Capitol Hill. It prints all government reports. The government printing office was going to print imminently a historical volume called Foreign Policy of the United States, 1947 to 1969, Greece, Turkey, Cyprus. Okay? It's no longer in print. And of the thousands of cables, declassified cables that were included in that book were the names of 3 cooperators with the CIA who were still alive. So we were going to go ask Condi Rice if she would order that the 3 mentions of those names be redacted. That was it. Because we didn't want, somebody to put 2 and 2 together and say, hey, these guys, oh, 1's still alive, 3 are still alive, whatever. They're all dead now. And I mean, it's the 1940s, the 1950s. So enough time has passed, it doesn't matter anymore. But we had an appointment to ask her to just redact these 3 names. So I walked over to Kofor's office to tell him that the car was waiting to pick us up at the west entrance. And 2001 was before we had the ability to watch TV on our computers. That came a year later. So several of us had little TVs on our desks. Kofor's secretary had a little TV. So I walked up to the secretary and I saw she had the news on and she's watching one of the World Trade Center towers burning. And I said, what happened to the World Trade Center? And she said, a plane flew into it. And I said, because I'm very smart, right? I said, that happened once before. In the 1930s, a bomber flew into the Empire State Building, but it was very foggy and rainy that day. And it's so clear today. How can you not see that you're flying into the World Trade Center? Like, what are you, stupid? And as soon as the words came out of my mouth, the second plane hit. And neither one of us said anything. And then she turned to me and she said, did you see that? Or did I imagine it? And I ran back to my office and I said, guys, 2 planes just hit both towers of the World Trade Center. I think we're under attack. And we all ran back up to Kofor's office. Now there were TVs mounted just below the ceiling above his office. And to picture his office, it's an enormous room, private offices all around the perimeter for the big shots. And then the rest of us were all in cubicles. So there were maybe 150 of us in these cubicles. Everybody then gathered in front of the TVs, including Kofor and all of the other seniors. And we're all just, and I mean, it's, CNN and BBC and MSNBC and Russian television and this one and that one and the French and the Turks. And everybody is covering this now. And we're standing there in silence. Finally, someone behind me shouts, can somebody please lead? And Kofor sort of snapped out of his stupor. And he says, you go to the director's office and tell him such and such. You go to security and tell them this. You go to the deputy director for operations. Finally, a special protective officer, it's the CIA police force, he came into the office and he says, everybody evacuate under the director's orders. Everybody out. Nobody budged. And then finally, someone said, I should add, in the interim, the Pentagon was hit. We knew that there was still a plane in the air. And then somebody said, we should probably assume that next plane is coming for us. And then the SPO came back into the office and said, if you don't evacuate now, everybody will be placed under arrest. And so we all evacuated. Well, it took me 2.5 hours to get out of the parking lot just to get onto the George Washington Parkway. And then I only got halfway home, and it was chaos, like you see maybe in World War Z. So I just abandoned my car on the highway and I walked the rest of the way. My girlfriend, who later became my wife, was on the top floor at CIA headquarters. She ended up coming to my place, I don't know, a half an hour later. We went to the roof of the building and we watched the Pentagon burn. And then we walked around trying to donate blood, but there was a 24-hour long line. And finally I said, this is ridiculous. We have to go back to work. And so we walked back to my car and I drove across the grassy median and then went back to CIA headquarters. And then I just stayed there for the next 4 days. I slept under my desk. We took a bolt cutters and cut the chain and lock on the cafeteria door. And we cooked all the food and just laid it out on folding tables in the hallway. And I mean, there were hundreds of us, maybe 1,000 of us that just worked 24 hours a day.
Well, you know at this stage, okay, so it's all hands on deck. There's going to be a huge amount of attention and focus on you and what you're doing. There will be people at very high levels trying to figure out, okay, what do we do now? Mm-hmm. And what you did for the first few weeks, the Americans did very little in terms of organizing, it seems, and focusing on, say, for example, Afghanistan. That came later.
It looks like it came later.
Yeah.
We sent a team into Afghanistan within 3 or 4 days.
Okay.
It was a small team of about a dozen guys, led by a legendary CIA officer by the name of Gary Schroen. And they parachuted into northern Afghanistan. They met up with the Northern Alliance and bought horses. We also dropped weapons by helicopter. And so they armed themselves, and then along with the Northern Alliance began operations, I guess is the best way to say it, against the Taliban. But the idea was we needed to find and kill Osama bin Laden as quickly as we possibly could. But he was very well hidden. And the story now is quite well known. He didn't see Gary Schroen's team as a real threat, not so long as the Taliban were protecting him. It was when the U.S. Air Force began bombing Afghanistan in October, about 3.5 weeks after 9/11. That's when al-Qaeda began to scatter. For the most part, the leadership went to Tora Bora. We knew that they were in Tora Bora, and we began bombing it mercilessly. But then the commander of Central Command made just a terrible, terrible mistake. We had almost surrounded the mountain where Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and the rest of the al-Qaeda leadership were holed up. We had killed Mohammed Atif, who was the military commander of al-Qaeda. We killed him in a bombing raid in Kabul. But we knew that bin Laden, his family, Zawahiri, his family, and all those others at the top of the food chain were in Tora Bora. We had a source who was acting as a CENTCOM translator, act as the go-between. And we told them that we were going to attack and we were going to kill everybody unless they gave up. And they said, in response, they would give up at dawn if we would allow free passage of the women and children. And CENTCOM agreed to that.
Hello, everyone. Apologies for the brief interruption. Quick request. Could everybody who has been watching the content and found the content enjoyable and perhaps is enjoying this conversation, could you hit the subscribe button? It makes such a difference to the channel. It really helps when trying to entice new guests to the platform. We're more likely to receive a favorable response the higher the numbers are. To everyone that has subscribed so far, thank you so much. I appreciate each and every one of you. And now back to the conversation with John I hope you're finding it as fascinating to watch as I found it to record. Thank you so much.
Instead, what happened was they used that night, which was about 8 hours of ceasefire, to escape into Pakistan. And so when dawn broke, nobody came down the mountain because there was nobody on the mountain to come down. They had all escaped. And then the hunt began. But the orders were very clear. We were to capture as many al-Qaeda fighters and al-Qaeda leaders as we possibly could. Bin Laden and Zawahiri, it didn't matter if they were taken dead or alive.
Were you in Pakistan at this stage, or were you?
I got to Pakistan the first week of January of 2002.
And you wanted to get into?
Yeah,
you want to get into Afghanistan, but
boy, did I! I was one of only 16 Arabic speakers at the CIA, which is just mind-boggling when you think of it. I mean, fluent Arabic speakers. There weren't many of us, and so I volunteered repeatedly to go to Afghanistan. Now, I had run into a colleague of mine, another legendary figure by the name of Billy Wah. Billy and I had done an operation together in the Middle East just 2 months earlier, and then Billy disappeared. And so I ran into him in the hallway in October, and I said, "Hey, Billy, where you been?" And he looked around and he whispers to me, "Afghanistan." And I said, "Really? What are you doing in Afghanistan?" And he said, "I've been killing people. What do you think I've been doing?" And it was then that it dawned on me. They didn't need linguists. They didn't need translators. They're not interviewing people. They're just killing them. So I went back to the deputy director of the Counterterrorism Center, who was a friend of mine. And I said, "If you don't send me to Afghanistan right now, I'm going to resign and I'm going to go straight to Exxon with my Arabic, and I am not going to look back." And so they sent me to Pakistan as the Chief of Counterterrorism Operations there. And, that was very fortuitous because for the most part, operations against al-Qaeda had ceased in Afghanistan. We had killed everybody who we hadn't driven across the border into Pakistan. And then the first thing that I did when I got to Pakistan, like literally on my first day, I made a recommendation to the chief there that we pull our officers off the border and just allow al-Qaeda to enter Pakistan. Because I said, look, that they're scared and they're going to make a mistake. And as soon as they make a mistake, we have them. Right? They have nowhere to go. They don't speak any of the languages there. They don't speak Urdu, Pashto, Sindhi, Punjabi. They speak Arabic.
They stick out like a sore thumb.
They stick out like a sore thumb.
You have for the Pakistani authorities would be more willing to cooperate than the Taliban, right?
Oh, heavens. You hear a lot about the Pakistanis. I thoroughly enjoyed working with the Pakistanis. I always say that the Pakistani intelligence service is essentially two separate organizations. ISI is two separate organizations. The half that I worked with were all educated at Sandhurst. They were all...
That's the British Military Academy for
British
officers.
Military Academy, correct. Many of them, most of them had done military training courses at bases around the United States. They all spoke fluent English, and they were fearless. The other half were the guys with the long beards who had created the Taliban, who were supportive of the Taliban and of Kashmiri separatist groups, terrorist groups, and didn't want anything to do with the United States. I never dealt with any of those people. I dealt with the counterterrorism pro-West people. And then when you are offering them pallets of money to do what you want, they do what you want.
Receptive.
Very receptive.
So you come up with a plan to, you can't get bin Laden, but you go after Zubaydah.
Right.
And you get him.
He was the very first high-value target that we searched for.
And he's number 3 in the hierarchy.
Yeah, we believed he was. He wasn't in the end.
Was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, was he number two? Was that the way?
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was number 3.
Was number 3. Okay.
See, we had never heard of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
Hmm.
It wasn't until we captured Abu Zubaydah, and I'm getting ahead of the story, but I think this is important. It wasn't until we captured Abu Zubaydah that we realized several things. Number one, he was not the number 3 in al-Qaeda. Number 2, he had never joined al-Qaeda. He was a bad man. He had founded the al-Qaeda safe house in Peshawar, Pakistan, called the House of Martyrs. He had founded and managed al-Qaeda's 2 training camps in Kandahar. He was a logistician for al-Qaeda. He would get you a fake passport, a ticket home. He would smuggle you into Afghanistan to make jihad. But he was not the number 3 in al-Qaeda. He had nothing to do with the planning of 9/11. Now, on the other hand, we knew, and we had known since the 1990s, that there was this very bad guy named Mukhtar. We knew that Mukhtar was a nom de guerre. We had no idea what this person's name was. And the reason we knew about this person was that in 1996, listen to how crazy this is. In 1996, a housekeeper went into a rented apartment to do the normal weekly house cleaning. And what she saw was plans laid out on a table indicating that a terrorist or a terrorist group intended to hijack 14 747 jumbo jets from Manila Airport and fly them into buildings up and down the west coast of the United States. It was called the Bojinka plot. She wasn't stupid. She recognized that this was the plans for a crime. So she called the Manila police. The Manila police came and said, "Ooh, this looks big." They called the Philippine Intelligence Service. They went to the apartment and said, "Uh-oh, we better call the Americans." And then the Americans came and, took the information. It's being plotted by this person, Mukhtar. Mukhtar realized he had been blown, so he just disappeared. It was months after the capture of Abu Zubaydah that Abu Zubaydah told FBI agent Ali Sufan during an interrogation that Mukhtar, he actually laughed when he said it. He said, "You don't know who Mukhtar is?" And Ali said, "No, we know the name Mukhtar, but we don't know who that is." And he laughed and he said, "I'll give you the name. It's Khalid Sheikh Mohammed." We had never heard of this person before. But then when we started to investigate, we realized, oh my God, he went to school in North Carolina. And he's smart and he has access to money. And then we realized what we were up against. It took us another year to find him and to capture him. We found him in a safe house in Rawalpindi, Pakistan. And we've had him ever since.
You've had him in Guantanamo Bay, where there are over 700 people that have been held and almost no convictions. We'll get to that in a second. Tell me about the operation. It's an extraordinary operation that you were in charge of, that you engineered, essentially designed to capture Zubaydah. And you got him, and he was, you tell the story. How did that happen, John?
Right. So we received notice from a sister agency that Abu Zubaydah was, exact words, somewhere in Pakistan. Pakistan has 250 million people. And they said, well, he's moving back and forth between Lahore and Faisalabad. Well, Lahore has like 12 million people, and Faisalabad has 7 million people. So what do you mean, go catch him? Like, go catch him how? The country's the size of Texas.
And there's no technology like we have today. I mean,
No way.
Are they even using mobile phones, cell phones at that stage?
Barely.
Yeah.
But they're all just flip phones. And that's when you could go into any kiosk and buy a phone, make one call and throw it in the trash. So all we knew is that he was just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between Faisalabad and Lahore. So we tried several different things. I won't bore you with the failures, but we just couldn't get it any closer. And it's funny, once we finally caught him, we also retrieved his diary, and he knew we were on his tail. Sometimes we were 3 days behind. Sometimes one time we were an hour behind, where there was still food on the table and it was still warm. So we were close, but never quite close enough. Finally, I sent a cable to headquarters and I said, I just can't think of any more ideas to catch him. I just can't think of anything. Can you send this friend of mine to Pakistan? He was a targeting analyst. Now, analysts are very different from targeting analysts. Analysts sit and think the big thoughts and write papers that they're for the president, but nobody really reads them for the most part. What's going to happen 5 years from now in, Taiwan or in the Egyptian economy? Nobody
Macro
really cares.
geopolitics, big ideas.
Yeah, big ideas.
Predictive.
Somebody at the State Department's going to read them and say, oh, that's interesting, or whatever. Targeting analysts pour through literally millions of pieces of data to try to geolocate somebody so that we can either kill him or capture him. So this friend of mine flew out from headquarters, and it wasn't until he landed that I was able to tell him why he was required there. And I said, this is big, man. This is going to make or break our careers. We've got to catch this guy. And he said, okay, I'll get started. He took a piece of butcher block paper about the size of a small American billboard, a roadside advertisement. And he wrote Abu Zubaydah in the center, put a circle around it. And then around that, he wrote down all of the phone numbers, the email addresses that had been in touch with Abu Zubaydah, or the physical addresses of people or places that had been in touch with Abu Zubaydah. And then he did a secondary and then a tertiary ring and made connections between all these different assets. I've said before, it was pretty to look at after he was done. It looked like a spider web, or like a work of art, really. But he finally came to me and he said, look, I can't get it to fewer than 13 sites, 13 possibilities. He's moving constantly. I said, well, geez, we've never hit more than 2 sites before in a night. We would do our raids at 2 o'clock in the morning with a team made up of CIA, FBI, and ISI officers, and sometimes a handful of local police. Although the Pakistanis never knew who the targets were. We would just say, look, take our word for it. It's a bad guy. Because we couldn't risk them, bragging about it in their headquarters, and then one of the Longbeards hears it and then tips off the bad guy, and either they're waiting to ambush us or they've already escaped. So I said, well, geez, we're going to have to hit all 13 sites simultaneously. So I wrote a cable to headquarters. I told them what I needed. I needed 36 people. I needed millions of dollars in cash. I needed guns, ammunition, secure communications, night vision goggles, stun grenades, you name it. They chartered a Boeing 737, loaded everything on. It landed at Lahore Airport 2 days later. We unloaded everything. I had purchased 2 safe houses. We put everything in the safe houses. And we briefed everybody so that they knew. See, we couldn't tell anybody what the operation was until they actually arrived, because we just couldn't risk loose lips sinking the ship, right? So I gathered everybody, CIA, FBI, ISI, and something called the Punjab Elite Force. It was a SWAT team, Special Weapons and Tactics Counterterrorism team, that belonged to the state of Punjab in central Pakistan. And I stood on a coffee table with everybody gathered around me, and I said, at the risk of sounding melodramatic, we're going to have to synchronize our watches like in the movies. And we did. Check. And I said, here's the plan. Those of you going to Faisalabad, we had to charter a bus. There were so many of us. Those of you going to Faisalabad are going to get on the bus at 10:30. This was at 10 p.m. And you're going to go to the safe house. Everybody else is going to remain here at this safe house. At 01:30, you're going to make sure you have all your weapons, all your ammunition, and your secure communications, which were encrypted walkie-talkies. By 01:40, leave the safe house. 01:55, be at the target. 01:58, make sure you have clear line of sight with the target. And exactly as the clock strikes 2, break down the door, separate the women and children from the men, grab all the men, and take them into custody. Then the FBI comes in and takes thousands of pictures of everything, and then we take it from there. Now, earlier in the day, a colleague of mine and I went with 3 Pakistanis to look at all 13 sites because we wanted to make sure we weren't being set up. There was going to be a gunfight. There was going to be an IED on the side of the road. It was a setup. We wanted to make sure that we had ingress and egress. It was all going to be safe. One of the sites was a payphone at a shish kebab stand. So clearly there's al-Qaeda living in the neighborhood, senior enough to be on the phone with Abu Zubaydah, but you can't raid a closed shish kebab stand at 2 o'clock in the morning. So we cut that from the list. That took us down to 12. While we were driving around, most of the other places were mud huts, corrugated tin roofs, just hovels. But while we were driving around, the analyst called me from Islamabad, and he said, listen, I just got a call from a friendly Western intelligence service. And they said that they had a walk-in come in today. A walk-in is somebody who literally just walks in off the street and says, I have intelligence that I want to give to your intelligence service. 99% of the time, they're either lunatics, they are what are called intelligence peddlers. They're going to take $100 from you, then they're going to go to the British embassy, then the French embassy, then the Israeli embassy, and that's how they make a living. Or they're probes. They're hostile intelligence services just looking to see, are your doors armored? Are your windows, bomb resistant? How many of your people have guns? Where are the security cameras? So if they decide to attack your embassy, they know where the vulnerabilities are. 99% fall into those 3 categories. 1% are the real deal. So I said, he said that the walk-in says that there's a huge group of al-Qaeda fighters in a big yellow house. And I said, I want to talk to the walk-in. And he said, I already asked. They said it's impossible and he can't be recontacted, which told me that there was no walk-in, that it was an intercept that they didn't want to tell us about. They believed that the information was important enough to pass to the Americans, but they didn't want us to know that they had a tap on somebody's phone. That's fine. We didn't care. So the analyst calls me again about 2 hours later. Well, first of all, we're driving through the campus of the University of Faisalabad. And when we came out the back gate of it, we came to the target site, and it was an enormous yellow house. And I said, that's the site. That's the site that the walk-in told us about. And the Pakistani liaison officer said, I can tell you there's something bad is going on in that house. I said, how do you figure? He said, it's 105 degrees today, and all of the shutters are closed. They have to be broiling in there. They just must not want anybody to know that they're in there. And I said, we have to put an especially big team on that house. We ended up catching, now I can't say, I'm not allowed to say exactly how many. We caught dozens of people inside that house. Then the analyst calls me a second time, and he said, Abu Zubaydah just made a terrible mistake. He downloaded his Hotmail emails from a landline. He accessed his Hotmail emails with a landline. And I said, oh my God. I knew he would make a mistake. This is what we had been waiting for months. And I said, give me the address. So he gives me the address, and it corresponds to the final target site. And I remember, I have chills all these years just thinking about it, telling the story. I turned to my colleague and I said, we got him. So we drive to the address, and it's an empty field. It's just an empty, undeveloped field. I said, how could this possibly be? We're sure that the call came from this location. And the Pakistani major kind of laughed, and he said, no. He said, this is quite common in Pakistan. He said, when a plot of land is legally divided, the phone company assigns it a telephone line, even if there's nothing built there. So when something eventually is built there, you just turn the line on. But what happens is people will climb the telephone pole. They'll splice their own telephone line into the empty lots telephone line so they can make calls, and the bill goes to the owner of the vacant lot. And I said, so he's here somewhere. How do we figure out what house is stealing the line? He calls a tech officer, a young Pakistani technical officer. The kid looked like he was 18 years old. He climbs the telephone pole, goes through this Medusa's head of wires. He literally follows it fist over fist down the telephone pole, down the alley. We're following him. And he says, it's that house right there. And that's where we got him.
So all of those operations had to take place at exactly the same time. Was it about 1 o'clock in the morning, I think, or 2
o'clock in the morning? Yeah. 2 o'clock in the morning. I remember going to the roof of the safe house. I looked at my watch and I said, 0200, here we go. And as soon as I said it, we could hear this sound in the distance, the sound of metal on metal, like boink, boink, boink. And I said, that's not good. This colleague of mine and I. And then we heard gunshots. And I said, oh, that's really not good. So I got on the walkie-talkie, and I knew which site was the closest. And I said, Site 13, what's going on over there? And he shouts, shots fired, shots fired. They're firing back at us. And I was like, oh my God. We jumped into the car. We sped over there as quickly as we could. And it was a scene of chaos. There was one man just laying dead in the street, like obviously dead. His eyes were open. There was another man who looked like he was dead or he was almost dead. And then there was a third who was just screaming bloody murder with a gunshot wound straight through the center of his femur. And I shouted at the Pakistanis. I said, damn it, I said, take them alive. Our orders were to take them alive. But this stupid Pakistani policeman with an AK-47 just started shooting them as they're jumping from the roof of the safe house to the roof of the neighboring house to escape. The dead man was a Syrian bomb maker. The second person shot may or may not have been Abu Zubaydah. We didn't know at that point. The third was Abu Zubaydah's bodyguard, also Syrian. So I said, who is this guy? The Pakistani said to me, we got him. We got your man. I said, which one is he? This one was the one who was almost dead. I said, that doesn't look anything like Abu Zubaydah. We had this like 6-year-old passport photo of a very handsome young man with a closely cropped beard and mustache. This guy was fat, clean shaven, crazy hair going all over the place. I said, that doesn't look anything like Abu Zubaydah. So my colleague said, what do you want to do? I said, I don't know what the fuck to do. So I called the analyst. I said, look, we may have gotten him, but I don't know if this is the guy. And he said, get me a shot of his eye. I'll run a retinal scan. So I kneeled down over him and I shouted, Iftah Hayunak, open your eyes. Nothing. So I pulled his eyelids up, but his eyes were rolled back in his head. And I said, look, he's dying. He's bleeding to death. I can't get a shot of his eyes. He was shot in the thigh, the groin, and the stomach with this AK-47. So he said, get me a picture of his ear. And I didn't know until that night that no two people on earth have the same ears. They're like fingerprints. So I took a picture of his ear. Remember, 2002, phones didn't have cameras. So I took a picture of his ear. I plugged my phone into the camera, and I was able to transmit the picture through the phone back to the analyst. He sent the picture to headquarters. They ran the ear scan, and then they said, it's him.
Headquarters in the United States?
Yeah. So this took some time, you might imagine. It took 15, 20 minutes. In the meantime, we're trying to stanch the bleeding, and it was just nightmarish. They came back, they said, it's him. We picked him up, we threw him in the back of this filthy Toyota pickup truck that we just commandeered from some poor guy happened to be driving through the neighborhood in the middle of the night. And we drove him to Faisalabad Hospital, which was a rough place. The story is too long to really get into the details, but they tried as best they could to try to get the bleeding to stop. He was, just as fast as they could pump the blood into him, it was just leaking right out of him. But al-Qaeda got word that we had gotten it, and they started driving by the hospital and just opening fire on the hospital. So I said to the Pakistani major, if they realize how lightly armed we are, we're dead. Can you get a helicopter in here? And he said, yeah, I think so. So he makes a call. About 20 minutes later, this helicopter lands in the parking lot. I just walked right into the operating room. I put my shirt up and I said, Doc, wrap it up. We have to go. They sewed him closed as quickly as they could. We put him on the helicopter. We flew him to a Pakistani military base about 50 miles away. They rushed him into surgery there. And then at one point, the doctor came out and he said, look, I've never seen wounds this severe where the patient lived. You should tell your people to be prepared for his death. So I called the analyst. I said, you should tell headquarters. They don't think he's going to live the night. And then he did. And I sat with him for the next 56 hours.
56 hours.
I've never been so tired in my life.
So you keep this guy alive. You know who this guy is at this stage. This must be one of the most thrilling events of your life. You know how big this is, not just for your career, but for the United States.
I knew it was life-changing. Yeah, it was life-changing. And for the United States. The analyst told me that when the station chief called headquarters, he called the director of the CIA directly. And the entire CIA leadership was in the room. And George Tenet, the CIA director, said, they got him. And the whole place erupted into cheers. And then he immediately called the president. So, everybody in, the intelligence community in Washington was waiting for the call.
So we've got Abu Zubaydah. Rendition happens now, right? So we're taking him back to Guantanamo, or
no?
Where?
He went to Guantanamo in, I think it was 2004, but for 2 years he was moved from secret prison to secret prison all around the world, subjected to merciless torture, and
by CIA operatives.
By CIA, it's even worse than that. By CIA contractors.
Right.
Yeah.
Would they be local, kind of Syrian or Sudanese or any?
These were two
Americans.
Sociopathic American psychologists by the names of James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, who had pitched to the CIA director a torture program that they called enhanced interrogation techniques. They also described it as learned helplessness, that you utterly break him psychologically, and then he'll tell you everything you want to know. The problem is that torture simply doesn't work. Besides the fact that it's immoral, unethical, and illegal, it doesn't work. They will tell you anything that they think you want to hear just to get you to stop torturing them. And then you have to assign a team of analysts to take the next 6 months to go through this information to figure out what was nonsense and what was actionable. And the stuff that's actionable, by the time you get to it, is so old that it's not actionable anymore. You know, especially when it comes to counterterrorism, time is of the essence, and you have to move on it quickly. Otherwise, once it gets stale, either the operation has taken place, or it's been moved, or it's been canceled, or the target has just scattered to the wind.
So there was no, we knew in 2001, 2002, 2003 that there was no utility whatsoever in torture techniques. So the only thing that would explain it is some kind of sadism.
Yes. You know, people underestimate the motivation of revenge after 9/11. 3,000 Americans were killed on one day because we were asleep at the switch. And so, you know, this was that one opportunity. This is how it was viewed at the senior levels. This one opportunity to redeem ourselves, right? To not just disrupt the next attack, but to kill or capture the entire al-Qaeda leadership. And, you know, as you said, you look into the abyss and the abyss is looking right back at you.
Yeah.
And, you know, I say all the time too, and I mean this very, very seriously. The CIA leaders who conceived of the torture program, implemented the torture program, defended the torture program, continue to support the torture program, even knowing deep down that it didn't work. Because when they die, their obituaries are going to say that they were the creators and the leaders and the implementers of torture. And if they keep repeating the lie over and over and over again, that it helped keep Americans safe, then that's a way to try to ensure their own legacy. I'm here to tell you that they're lying to us. It wasn't effective. It wasn't helpful. And if anything, it made anti-American terrorism worse.
In 2007, you went on ABC a few years later. You left the CIA shortly afterwards, in around 2004, 2005, and you went into private enterprise. Something happens, 2007 arrives, you do an interview with ABC with Brian Ross, is it?
Right.
Where you decide, now you must have been, your wife was also in the CIA at this stage. You must have had this multiple conversations with your wife, this is what I'm going to do. And you must both together must have known that, oh my God, when you do this, because you draw a direct line between torture and the United States president.
Yes, I did. In fact, the president said the next day, his exact words, I don't know this man. I don't know this man's motivation. I don't know why this man threw me under the bus. The truth is, he had been lying to the American people. You know, I did not initially accept Brian Ross's invitation. But what happened that week was there was a press conference, a presidential press conference. And there had been reports from the International Committee of the Red Cross, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International, all saying that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. And so a reporter asked President Bush about these reports, and he looked right in the camera and he said, "We do not torture." And I remember telling my wife, we were sitting there on the couch watching this, and I said, he is a bald-faced liar. He is looking the American people in the eye and he's lying to them. But, you know, that's Washington. 4 days later, it was a Friday, and he was walking from the south portico of the White House to the helicopter to fly to Camp David for the weekend. And a reporter shouted a question about torture. And he paused and he turned and said, well, if there is torture, it's because of a rogue CIA officer. And I said to my wife, they're going to try to pin this on me. So I called Brian Ross and I said, I'll do your interview. And I decided that no matter what he asked me, I was going to tell the truth. So what I ended up saying was the CIA was torturing its prisoners, that torture was official US government policy, and the policy had been personally approved by the president. And then the entire weight of the US government fell on my head.
Yeah, when you're in those crosshairs, they say the process is the punishment. So they're going to bankrupt you financially. True. So it's going
to take. And they did.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You know, the irony is that the Bush Justice Department investigated me for a full year, from December of 2007 to December of 2008. And then they determined that I had not committed a crime. They sent a declination letter to my attorney saying that I had not revealed classified information because torture is a crime and it is illegal to classify a criminal act. So I was off scot-free. My wife and I were so excited, we actually went to dinner that night to celebrate. 4 weeks later, Barack Obama became president. And John Brennan, who was one of the founders of the torture program, became Obama's chief intelligence advisor. He became the deputy national security advisor for counterterrorism. And then he went on to be the CIA director. John and I never liked each other. And he and I were on completely opposite sides of this torture issue. I had no idea that as soon as he entered the White House, John asked the Justice Department to secretly reopen the case against me. And so for the next 3 years, my phones were tapped, my emails were being intercepted, and teams of FBI agents were following me everywhere I went. And then finally, in January of 2012, this is more than 4 years after I blew the whistle, I was arrested and charged with 3 counts of espionage, 1 count of violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1981, a very obscure law, and making a false statement. We were never really sure what the false statement was supposed to have been. But what they did, as you just alluded to, is they waited until I went bankrupt, and then they dropped the espionage charges. Now, remember, too, espionage can be a death penalty charge. They were offering me 45 years in prison if I would plead guilty. I said, I'm not going to do 45 minutes in prison. I said, you guys are the criminals here, not me. And, you know, you're right. The process is the punishment. It wrecked everything. Socially, my friends, my former colleagues, even family members walked away from me.
But your wife was still in the CIA at this stage, was she, or had she left?
Yes, sir. She was fired on the day of my arrest only because she was married to me. Yes.
There's no HR process here. You're out the door.
Out. The CIA is an unusual organization in that out of the entire US government, CIA officers serve at the pleasure of the president. We don't get the same civil service protections that everybody else in government gets. If the president doesn't like your face, you're out, and there's nothing you can do. And the president didn't like me.
Well, John Brennan didn't like you either. It seems, I mean, the fact that they were torturing people, like they said, if they can pin it on a rogue, then they don't have to take collective accountability.
Well, that's right. I had a friend in the CIA who, we go to the same church, we're in the same men's group. He just happens to be a brigadier general in the Army and a psychiatrist at the CIA. And he said to me one day, you know, they call you the human rights guy behind your back. And I said, I know, I've heard them. He said, you know, that's not a compliment, right? And I said, Steve, I'm on the right side of history and they are not.
People watching your story might say the impetus to act was when you realized it wasn't necessarily moral or ideological stand you were taking, even though clearly you were very uncomfortable with the whole torture thing. It was when you realized you were in the crosshairs.
Yes.
That's when you jumped and moved. Because you knew you were in big trouble here.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to save myself. Still, you know, I kept waiting for somebody to say something, because after the Abu Zubaydah capture, I got a big promotion. I became the deputy director's executive assistant. And so in that job, I got to see literally everything that the CIA was doing around the world. Well, there were dozens of cables coming back from the secret site saying, this is illegal, I'm resigning, or I'm curtailing my assignment, I'm coming back to headquarters, I can't believe we're torturing this man, this is unethical, this violates my Hippocratic oath. So I wasn't the only person who thought this was a criminal act. And I thought, surely somebody is going to say something. And then nobody said anything. So in the interim, I had done research. I'm not an attorney. So I started researching the law. And the law was crystal clear that this whole program was illegal. I felt confident that I was on the right side of this.
The process was the punishment in your case. I remember you did mention the fact that at one point you thought you were sitting beside your wife watching television. At one point you thought about going into the garage, putting the key in the ignition.
Oh yeah.
And saying, "Okay, guys, I'm out of here."
Yeah, I did.
I did. It must have been torturous, reputationally. You know, they say Will's story in his book, The Status Game, has highlighted that one of the what makes people take their own lives, men in particular, is a sudden and catastrophic loss of status. Right. So you, as well as all of this happening, you have this massive catastrophic reputational global. Your community see you as a traitor, potentially. You have the American justice system all over you. You're paying $750 an hour to lawyers that you can't. How can anybody afford that?
And there were 11 of them.
And yeah, do you
I still owe them. I still owe them $1,150,000 that they will never see, never.
So were they doing this work pro bono, John, or what was how did you manage to?
Of the 11, 6 were pro bono. The remaining 5, I still owe $1.15 million. But with that said, they told me early on, look, this case is far bigger than John Kiriakou. This is a case that involves constitutional protections. It's a case that involves the rule of law. It's a case that involves the war on whistleblowers. You know, between 1917 and 2009, 3 Americans were charged with espionage for speaking to the press. Just under John Brennan and Barack Obama, 9 of us were charged with espionage for speaking to the press. That's 3 times all previous presidents combined. So there's a real transparency problem in government.
Why do you think the Obama administration was so determined, as opposed to the Bush administration? Surely the Bush administration would want to get you.
You'd think. As crazy as it sounds, the Bush administration was more concerned about the rule of law. And I'm telling you this as a 3rd-generation Democrat. I'm no longer a Democrat. I'm independent. I hate everybody equally. And but what it was that there was 2 factors. John Brennan had an obsession with national security leaks. And number 2, Barack Obama was so inexperienced to be president that he just did, on national security issues, he just did whatever Brennan told him to do. The guy was a senator for 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah, I was
no intelligence experience at all. Nothing.
Yeah. So you eventually you take the plea. You do the 2 years in jail. You come out. What is your status now? Are you considered a convicted felon? Can you get Can you work? Like, how does it affect your ability, your powers of recovery? Right. How did you recover from all of this?
Honestly, I have to thank my wife, now my ex-wife, unfortunately. The pressure that this puts on families, it's insurmountable. But she said, look, you have to embrace this. You can't run from it or pretend it didn't happen. You have to embrace it. You didn't do anything wrong. You have to be the torture whistleblower, whether you want to or not. And she was right. You know, I couldn't get a job stocking shelves at a grocery store, working at Target, working at a gas station. I applied for a job as a baggage handler at the airport. No one would touch me. So I decided to just make my own work. I started writing, and I write constantly. Now I'm working on my 9th book. My first made the New York Times bestsellers list. My second won 2 literary awards, including one of the big 4. I write a column for Covert Action Magazine. I write a column for Consortium News. At the time, I also had a column at Reader Supported News. I do op-eds for the Los Angeles Times. I lecture at different universities, University of Southern California, the University of Salamanca in Spain. I'm starting a global speaking tour in Ireland in 2 weeks. So I just made my own path. And little by little, people begin coming around to the point where in 2016, I was nominated by a Swedish parliamentarian for the Nobel Peace Prize. I was invited by the commandant of the military academy at West Point to speak to the freshman class about ethics in intelligence operations. I've had 3 FBI agents, most recently 2 weeks ago, 3 FBI agents who were on my case apologize to me and say that it was a political case and that they were forced to do it and that they were sorry that they hadn't spoken out. So, you know, I'm comfortable with who I am. I don't know if the torturers are, but I know I am.
And you're coming to Ireland in 2 weeks. A couple of questions I wanted to. It would be remiss of me not to ask you. Shannon Airport in the west of Ireland, there was rumours that it was used as a staging post for Rendition. Are you aware of anything to do with Shannon?
I heard those same rumours. We didn't use Shannon while I was there, so I have no inside information, but I can tell you that I also know several very, very good investigative journalists who have taken years to go through flight data that's publicly available. Just very few people have the wherewithal to put it together, and they are 100% confident that Shannon has been used for rendition flights. Yes.
What's your perspective on Edward Snowden, American hero or American?
Oh, I think Snowden is a bona fide hero. The American people would never have known that the American government, in violation of the law, was spying on us. Not only do we have a law in black and white that the US government is not permitted to spy on Americans, it is a part of NSA's charter, its founding charter, that it may not spy on Americans. And now a majority of its work is spying on Americans. We wouldn't have had any idea that that was the case had it not been for Ed Snowden.
Has Ed Snowden changed anything? No, he's just illuminated. He's shined a light into the place.
The change hasn't come, and specifically the change that you're talking about is called Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Now, every 2 years, when that section is renewed, permitting warrantless wiretapping of American citizens, there are more votes against it in Congress. I'm confident that eventually we're going to get to the point where NSA won't be able to spy on us anymore. We're not there yet, but we'll get there.
Wow, that's a big, bold statement. That would be a massive positive impact.
It would. And, you know, the funny thing, too, is, and I'll preface this by saying I disagree with 95% of everything that Donald Trump stands for. But Donald Trump is right about warrantless wiretapping and Section 702 and NSA spying on Americans, because NSA spied on him. You know, it was the Clinton administration that authorized NSA to spy on Donald Trump and the Trump campaign in 2016. And that's just not right.
That's shocking, yeah. That has been well documented and it's indisputable, right? Or was there a court case around that? Or
and the Justice Department said, no, we didn't spy on him. It's that there were some people around him that we thought maybe were doing illegal things. No. If you suspect the man of a crime, and panel a grand jury and investigate the crime. You don't go to a secret office in the Justice Department and say, psst, we want you to tap Donald Trump's phones. Don't tell anybody. Yeah, you can't do that. That's not the American way.
Last question, and I think I know what you'll say, but if you could change anything, if you could go back and looking back at your life,
Yeah.
would you do the Brian Ross interview again?
Yes, but, and this is something I tell every would-be whistleblower who asks me for advice, hire a lawyer first. Before you speak a single word, hire a lawyer skilled in national security law and make sure he is sitting next to you when you do the interview. I had to be reactive, which was a terrible, terrible mistake. Other whistleblowers should be proactive.
John Kiriakou, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and fascinating
My
to meet
pleasure.
you. Your story is extraordinary,
Thank you.
and I wish you every success in rebuilding and recovering.
Thanks so much.
And posterity, let's see how
appreciate it.
it will be, how you will be remembered for your services to the United States and for revealing a shocking episode in its history.
Thank you so much. May I make one plug?
Yes.
I'm excited to begin a speaking tour. It's going to be a 100 event global speaking tour, but we're starting in Ireland in 2 weeks and then moving on to 40 dates in England, Scotland, and Wales. If you go to Tigers Lane Studios, which is a London-based production company, the schedule is there. There are still some tickets available, and I would love to see everybody.
Yeah, I'm going to put a link to it. I checked the tickets out. Tickets are available. It's in the Crown Plaza in North Dublin, and you're going to be in Belfast as well. I'll put a link to it in the description box. There are still some tickets available that can be grabbed, and I think everybody, should go and meet and see.
It would be a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Great to meet you.
Lovely to meet you too. Thank you, John.